Lee, welcome to the program. How are you?
I'm doing great, Glenn. Great to be with you again.
Yeah, I love talking to you. I'm really excited to hear the case for Christmas. Now, you were an atheist,
Yes.
and we've talked about this before. Your eyes opened up, and how did you get to the place to where you're like, okay, let me see if I can make the case for the baby Jesus in the manger?
Well, yeah, being an atheist, my wife became a Christian, so I decided to try to rescue her from this cult that she's gotten involved in. So that launched me on an investigation into the historical reliability of Christianity. I did that for 2 years until I became convinced that in light of the evidence, it would take more faith to maintain my atheism than to become a Christian. So I became a Christian, ended up leaving journalism and so forth, and written many books about it. But I wanted to do a book on Christmas because in the Christmas season, there seems to be a more spiritual openness than any other time of the year. Even when I was an atheist, I felt more spiritually sensitive during the time of Christmas. I don't know why. I guess it's because it permeates the culture. And so
I think it's because we see hope, we see goodness in one another. It's different.
Yes, exactly. But how do we know that it's based on reality? How do we know? We can all enjoy the parties and the gift giving and so forth, but how do we know it's really based on historical reality? That's what really intrigues me as someone who's kind of a history buff.
Okay, so take me through that. How do we know?
Well, we've got two real early, independent, but consistent reports about the birth of Jesus in Bethlehem 2,000 years ago. One comes from the Gospel of Luke. Now, Luke was I love this guy. He was a first century investigative reporter. He was a companion of St. Paul. And Luke said, he didn't say, well, I'm going to tell you about something that happened in the distant past once upon a time. No, he said, I carefully investigated everything so I could write an orderly account about the certainty of what took place. So he's claiming, I'm writing about what actually took place. I believe he writes from Mary's perspective. I think he may have interviewed Mary. If he didn't, I think he interviewed Susanna and Joanna, who were friends of Mary, who he mentions in his gospel. And then we have Matthew. Matthew was he was a disciple. Matthew was right there in the first century setting. He later became a leader in the church in Jerusalem. And one of the other leaders was a guy named James, who was the half-brother of Jesus. So James, I think, communicated to Matthew kind of the guy's perspective of the birth of his brother Jesus. And so here we've got, by the way, I was talking to a woman the other day, and she has a young child, and I was talking to her about this, and she said, yeah, if you ask my husband the story about the birth of our child, and you ask me, you're going to get two different perspectives.
Yes.
We're going to be consistent.
Yes.
It's the same birth, we're talking about the real situation. So we've got these two very early reports that are independent, that are consistent with each other. And then we have a very interesting report in the Gospel of Mark. Now, Mark is writing based on the recollections of Peter, who was one of the inner circle with Jesus. And he starts his gospel later in Jesus' life, so he doesn't have a birth narrative. But interestingly, in Mark 6, verse 3, he refers to Jesus as Mary's son. Now, in first century Jewish culture, you would never do that. You were always your father's son. It would have been Joseph's son. Even if Joseph were already deceased, you would always refer to him as Joseph. And no, he referred to him as Mary's son. I think that was a wink to say, yeah, I know Joseph wasn't his biological father. And then we have John, who writes the last gospel. He doesn't repeat a lot of the historical stuff in the first three gospels. He writes from a grand theological perspective about the incarnation. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then the Word came into our world and dwelt among us. So it was very theological. But interestingly, John had a disciple who he mentored. And that guy wrote a letter. And in that letter, he says Jesus was, quote, really and truly born of a virgin. Where did he get that idea? I think it was from John, who wrote the Gospel of John.
So is it concerning at all? Because I've heard this argument before. When the Gospels all say the same thing, it's pretty clear. But they can't even decide. They can't even agree on the last words of Christ when he's on the cross. And is it does it matter? Should we be concerned that only 2 of the 4 Gospels talk about the birth?
No, I don't think so, because, first of all, those are 2 solid sources historically and very early. Mark gives us a reference to the fact that Joseph was not the biological father, and he also portrays Jesus as being the unique Son of God. And John, of course, was a theological take on the incarnation, is basically saying the same thing. So, no, I don't think that's a problem. And the differences in the Gospels, I don't think are a problem either, because, as someone trained in law, if you're in a trial and the witnesses get up and they all say the exact same thing, you object and say, Your Honor, collusion. They got together, they worked out the story, and you can't trust it. But when you have different perspectives, people emphasize different things. There's, for instance, a technique that was used in ancient literature that's used today called literary spotlighting. And what that means is somebody will focus on what one person is saying or doing, and other people will focus on other people who are involved in the same scene. But it's not contradictory. They're just focusing on different aspects of the same scene. So when you look at what the... Yeah.
No, I'm sorry to interrupt.
I was going to say...
Finish, and then I have a question on this.
Sure. When you look at the literary techniques that were used in the first century by other ancient writers like Plutarch and so forth, these historians, and you use those same literary techniques in writing the New Testament, these discrepancies between the Gospels virtually disappear.
So let me take you here, and I believe in this story. So, but I want to push back as hard as I can on this. The virgin birth is so hard for people to accept. And especially once you look at Greek mythology, you're like, this is the same story. They're just plagiarizing. This is, half man, half God. This is Hercules.
Right.
So how do you respond to that?
Yeah, I actually deal with this in my book. This is totally bogus. This was invented by German theologians in the 1800s. In the early 1900s, the Christians responded to it and answered it and refuted it. But now it's come up again, I think, because the internet has dredged up these old arguments. So, for instance, you've got the most famous example is Dan Brown in his book and movie, The Da Vinci Code, where he says, Christianity just copied all this stuff. He says there was an ancient myth called Mithras, and Mithras was born of a virgin on December the 25th. He had 12 disciples. He died for world peace. He was resurrected from the dead. So now Jesus is just kind of plagiarizing this. That story of Jesus was invented by people and plagiarized from Mithras. Well, I investigate that, and what do you find? You find in the actual myth of Mithras, number one, he was not born of a virgin. The myth was he emerged fully grown, naked, wearing a hat out of a rock. That's not...
But I mean, it's the same thing.
Yeah, I guess you could say the Rock is a virgin, but I mean that's ridiculous. Yeah. Secondly, born on December the 25th. Well, so what? We don't know the date Jesus was born. That's not in the Bible. The ancient records don't record it. Ancient Christians did not care about birthdays. Third, he didn't die for world peace. He was known for killing a bull. Fourth, he didn't have 12 disciples. According to one version, he had one disciple. According to another version, he had 2 disciples. He wasn't resurrected from the dead. There is nothing in the myth about Mithras about him dying, and so nothing about a resurrection. So all of these parallels, supposed parallels, disappear when you investigate what actually took place. People say, Alexander the Great, there was a myth that he was conceived by Zeus, the god Zeus. Well, even Alexander the Great's own mother, Olympias, said it's not true. It's crazy. It's just a story. It's not true. So every one of these supposed myths that predated Christianity, none of them are parallels to the story of Jesus' birth in Bethlehem.
All right, I'm going to take a 1-minute break, and then I want to ask you about the one Greek word that shed new light on the traditional Christmas story. Tell me about the one Greek word that opens things up.
It really does change everything about the common perception of Christmas. The common idea of Christmas that people have is that Mary and Joseph, because of a census, had to go to Bethlehem to register, and they get there, and she's about to give birth, and so they go to a lodge or an inn, and the mean old innkeeper says, "Sorry, no room here," and closes the door in their face. And so they go off to a stable, and she gives birth among the animals and puts the baby in a manger. Well, what that comes from is just a sentence in the Gospel of Luke where he says the baby was placed in a manger because there was no room for Mary and Joseph in the katalima. That's the Greek word, the katalima. So the question is, what does that word mean? Does it mean an inn? There was no room at the inn? I don't think so, and most scholars don't think so. That's how it was translated in the King James in 1611, but it's probably not the best translation. So let me explain something, how a house looked in first century Bethlehem. There was one large room broken down into two parts. The larger part was the living area. That's where people would live, eat, sleep. And then there was a couple of steps down to a smaller area where the animals were brought at night. And they were like pets. You know, they may have a couple of goats, a couple of sheep. And there was a manger there. But because there was a couple of stairs up, they would sometimes come up in the living area. Because, you know, how cute are they? They're little lambs. They're like pets. And so there was a manger also in the living area. Well, some of the more wealthy people had a katalima, a guest room. It had a separate entrance, and it made their house bigger. What apparently happened is that Mary and Joseph arrived in Bethlehem, and they went to the home of a relative and knocked on the door and said, "Hey, we're here for the census." And they said, "Oh, that's great, but you know what? We got a lot of people here for the census. There's no room for you in the guest room, the katalima. But you can give birth in the living area." And yes, there is a manger there. And yes, some of the animals may have come up the stairs because of the commotion and what was going on. And yes, the baby was probably put there in a manger. Now, in the year 1395, John Wycliffe, who did a translation into English of the Greek Bible, translated it as a guest room. The New International Version, which is probably the most popular translation in America today, doesn't use the word inn. It uses guest room. Now, Luke, in writing this account, he knew what word to use. Katalima, he uses it one other time, and in that other instance, it was also a room in a house. There's another word he uses, pandoheion, which is a Greek word that means an inn. And he does use that word when he talks about the parable of the Good Samaritan. So he knew if he wanted to use the word inn, he would have used pandoheion, but he didn't. He used katalima. And the conviction of most scholars is it just means a guest room. There probably was no inn.
Wow.
And by the way, yeah, I know, it's kind of mind-blowing, isn't it, after all we've heard?
Yeah.
And the other thing is, in first century Jewish culture, the value of hospitality was so high that it would have been impossible for an innkeeper to turn away a pregnant Jewish woman. I mean, he would have been ostracized from the tree. He would have run out of town on a rail. It would have destroyed his business. You could not do that because the value of hospitality was so high. And we don't even know there were any inns in Bethlehem. It was a small town, 500 people. It wasn't on a main crossroads. There may or may not have even been an inn there in the first place. So, but I think, you know, the majority of scholars, I think, would agree that the word really means guest room and not an inn.
That changes everything. It changes your whole vision of that. You know what I mean?
Yeah. It does.
Mind-blowing.
I know.
It's just totally mind-blowing. Yeah.
It is. Not only that, the image we have is that Mary is on the verge of giving birth as she's arriving, and it makes it urgent. That's not in the text either. It just says that while they were in Bethlehem, she gave birth. Doesn't say they're in Bethlehem 5 minutes or 5 days or 5 months. Where the idea of the urgency comes from is a book of fiction that was written in 200 A.D., a lot afterwards, no real historical connection. And in that fictional account, Mary and Joseph are approaching Bethlehem. They get 3 miles away from Bethlehem, and she had to give birth. And so they went into a cave, and she gave birth among some animals in a cave. That's where the idea of a cave comes up, because people envision her giving birth in a cave. That's from a book of fiction that doesn't have historical reality written, way, way, way later.
I have so many questions, Lee. Can I have you back next week? I have so many questions on this. I'd
absolutely.
love to have you back next week on this, because I want to talk to you about the Old Testament prophecies, because people will say, well, they just wrote that in later because they knew, he was a fulfillment. So they look and they just jammed this story together. But you have the answers to all of that. So I'd love to have you back next week.
Absolutely. Just let me know.
You got it. Lee, thank you so much. God bless you. Merry Christmas.
My
We'll
pleasure.
talk to you next week. You bet. It's a fascinating book. You got to read it. The Case for Christmas. Just did. It'll turn everything upside down. And I love those kinds of things, that make you think and look at things in a new and different way. Lee Strobel I think he's one of the best. He's the author of The Case for Christ, but his new book is The Case for Christmas. How you can know for sure what was laying in that manger and where was that manger? Was it in the kitchen, apparently? I don't know.